Greetings to all who are watching, and thank you for being here. I'm Dmitry Glinsky, and let me offer some comments on the Geneva summit between Presidents Biden and Putin. This will be part of a series that we are launching via our Center for the Analysis and Development of Russian-Speaking Diasporas. But I'm talking to you today entirely in my personal capacity as a political analyst, which I haven't been doing very often in recent years, and not as an associate of any of the community organizations that I'm involved with. However, the voices of those Russian Americans who care about the rights and freedoms in Russia and about the course of its development, especially the voices of refugees and exiles from the Putin regime and others who believe that Russia deserves a better way and a more humane future, have so far not been heard in American public debate on domestic or international issues. And in this part of the diaspora, there is a lot of untapped expertise on these topics. Besides, an increasing number of Russian Americans are US citizens and voters, and more of them feel that they cannot remain indifferent to the state of US-Russian relations and the conditions that shape them. This reformist, for lack of a better term, part of the community welcomed the change of the course on Russia from the Trump to the Biden administration. It was heartened by the new president's emphasis on rebuilding democratic institutions and alliances, on rallying democratic forces all over the world through the planned Summit of Democracy, and bringing human rights back to international diplomatic agenda. The Biden presidency and its slim majority in Congress offer perhaps the best hope in some 30 years of real American support for those who are fighting for human rights in other countries. To those of us who studied history and lived through it, the administration's rhetoric reminds of the Carter and Reagan era policies that helped the struggle for human rights in the Soviet Union to really succeed, at least for a period of time. It is clear, however, that just as under Carter and Reagan, the US government has to juggle many competing priorities. And human rights may not always come on top, but it should always be present in the mix, not swept under the rug as an inconvenient distraction. That is why American Russian-Speaking Association for Civil and Human Rights wrote an open letter to President Biden on the eve of the summit, urging him to speak in Geneva for those unjustly imprisoned for political and religious reasons. And those are over 200 people jailed for belonging to Muslim organizations, around 60 Jehovah's Witnesses, and over 60 political dissenters in Russia. So in this light, how should the summit be interpreted? Was its human rights cup half full or half empty? Well, the very fact that Washington has put human rights back on the bilateral agenda clearly and straightforwardly is already a sea change, in comparison not just with Trump or Bush Jr., but also with Biden's Democratic predecessors. In fact, with the entire diplomacy of the age of globalization that privileged corporate and elite interests over those of ordinary humans. So not only is America back at the helm of the democratic world, but human rights are also back at the table, which was by no means preordained. And as President Biden said at his press conference, human rights are always going to be on the table. This U-turn from the cynicism and narrow-mindedness of the past several decades is no small feat, especially given the resistance to human rights diplomacy on the part of the transnational lobbies of autocrats and some corporations in Washington. This resistance that has recently spilled over to the pages of established publications, such as Foreign Affairs and Project Syndicate, where you can read articles calling on President Biden not to confront autocrats, not to build his policies on the foundation of democratic values and principles, and to please keep the same old realpolitik over which average citizens, let alone immigrants and exiles, are not supposed to have any say. And beside resistance in Washington, we also see quite some resistance in West European capitals, where the influence of the autocrats and their commercial partners is so much more powerful than in America, which makes it clear that as long as major European democracies, our country's primary allies, are being hamstrung by these kinds of influences, the joint position of the democratic world on human rights will still be powerful and still important, but not as effective as it should. And given this, the will and the determination of President Biden and his team to lead on human rights, in spite of these pressures, to educate the rest of the democratic world about the centrality of its foundational ideas and values to its very survival, that is what will be truly critical. So, what is the takeaway from all this for Russian political exiles and their friends in the immigrant community and beyond? There is no alternative to continuing to build their own human rights lobby and its capacity to intervene in public debate on US foreign policy. And this is in spite of the fact that this community doesn't have any of the traditional sources of influence in America, neither the power of money nor the power of the numbers, and is facing all kinds of biases and resistance. But it has the power of intellect, of perseverance, and of being able to tell the right from the wrong. The human rights-oriented part of the Russian-American diaspora needs to be augmenting and amplifying this kind of power, using it to support the agenda of building back American democracy at home, including the defense of voting rights and the ferocious assault today, and the foreign policy that will make the Western world more democratic and more committed to its underlying values in practice and not merely in rhetoric. And this means asserting the place of the human rights-oriented Russian Americans in public life, even though it doesn't come without a price for some of us, not just in Putin's Russia, but also abroad, because the lobbyists of autocracy and of realpolitik are present and active in Washington and elsewhere. They are influential and vindictive and always looking to retaliate for any critique. But continuing and expanding international advocacy for Russia as political prisoners, and broader, for a kind of diplomacy that may contribute to the humanization of Russia and to peaceful changes within it, which in turn would make the rest of the world so more secure and united in the face of existential threats, as was envisioned by Andrei Sakharov, among others. This is what the anti-authoritarian flank of the Russian-American diaspora owes to both its native and its adopted countries.